The Spanish Civil War may not be known to all, but the events that occurred during these times of battle were detrimental to the history of Spain. Not only was the war historic in the events that ensued, but they were also due to the fact that people who were living during these brutal years had their lives and their entire families' lives changed for years to come. The focus point of this documentary is the Spanish Civil War ration coupons that were used as tools for the families and soldiers across Spain. The coupons are a primary source that can be observed to take a closer look into what society had to go through during these treacherous times known as the Civil War. But we also will discover more about these coupons as the film continues.
The Spanish Civil War began on January 17, 1936, and wreaked havoc on the territory all the way up until the last day of battle, which was April 1, 1939. The tensions really sparked a couple months prior, on November 6, 1936, when the nationalist forces arrived in Madrid and expected to have an easy entry, but instead they were met by brigades. That is when the tensions hit their carrying capacity, and violence ensued. It may be hard to fathom why wars begin in the first place, and that is no different for this war. But when looking down at the defining features of this war, the failure of Spanish democracy was the leading reason as to why the conflict started in the first place.
Spanish political and social parties refused to obey democratic laws, which did not go over well with those of high standing status in Spain. Failure to obey rules that are set in place can be a struggle for any region or empire, but the Spanish made their refusal so severe that it continued to be a catalyst in the tensions. These tensions eventually kept rising until the first steps of war took place.
The two sides that maintained status in the Spanish Civil War, and who eventually took up the two sides to the war, were socialism and fascism. This, of course, was pre-World War II. Socialism can be described as a political and economic theory of social organization, which advocates for the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. And on the other hand, fascism can be seen as a belief that we should stand for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictator, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. In order to think of it in simpler and more easy to understand terms, the Spanish Civil War was also known as the fight between the Republicans and the Nationalists. The nationalist side of this battle was also seen as the rebels.
As with any war that is filled with tensions and tragedy, propaganda became an important piece of the puzzle for civilians during this time. Propaganda was not uncommon as soon as the first couple days after the start of the war. These propaganda posters, stickers, and rations became weapons of the war, but these were weapons used off the battlefield and did not affect the soldiers directly, but were more focused towards the citizens of Spain. The ration coupons studied also contained depictions of propaganda that contained a myriad of different focus points. We will go into more detail about what propaganda was exactly on these coupons, but that will be discussed later in the film.
For further depth into the two opposing sides of the war, the Spanish government was known as the Republicans. The Republicans were also known as the left side. This war between the rebels and the Republicans ended up causing more than 500,000 deaths. These deaths were not just known as numbers. They were the loss of family members and loved ones, and the impact is still felt today by all of Spanish society.
Each of the sides of the war had aid from different parts of the world and different groups of people. The Republican left side had help from the communists and eventually became a part of the left side entirely. Anarchists also helped in the fight against Francisco Franco and the nationalist side.
The worker part of society even tried to get involved and help, but Republicans usually didn't give them access to weapons. But their drive to fight in the war did not go unnoticed. Back in the country part of life, peasants took over land and began to distribute it. They very much wanted to help the war effort in order to end the war. They gave everything they had, even though it was not much, to help the Republicans in order to defeat the nationalists. In addition to help from communists, the USSR also gave additional support to the Republican government. And finally, more help was given by small brigades and foreign volunteers. All the help given caused tensions to rise even further and made the Spanish Civil War become as detrimental as it was, and led to the immense amount of deaths and terrible consequences that ensued.
The other side, the nationalists, were also seen as the rebels of the army, led by Francisco Franco. The Republicans were not the only ones who were aided by outside forces in order to gain the upper hand. The nationalists, or the rebels, were also aided by a few very powerful allies and civilians who wanted a change.
Many monarchists wanted there to be a restoration of the monarchy in Spain. They wanted this restoration to replace the republic, and in order to restore this monarchy, they aided the nationalist side of the war.
There were many civilians that wanted the nationalists to win, so they aided the rebels. These civilians included the bourgeoisie, who were considered middle class and some upper middle class, as well as landlords who wanted to help fight for democracy.
The Nationalist Army also received help from Hitler's Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler sent its support to help aid Francisco Franco and his rebel army. The support that Hitler sent in was a very powerful air support which gave the rebels an advantage in the war. This gave them an advantage since this was one of the first times where air tactics were involved in combat, and this would eventually lead to the abundance and importance of air power during World War II.
The nationalists were also aided by Mussolini's Italy, and the reason why Mussolini gave Francisco Franco and his rebels their aid was because Franco allowed Italy to have bases in Spain, in case there was ever an outbreak of war between Italy and France. The Spanish Civil War was a very violent and bloody war that altered the Spaniards' lives forever and depoliticized a big part of society.
The war was even bigger than the two parties and fighting. It had lasting impacts on civilians, too. In fact, there were 500,000 civilian deaths. The conflict also impacted the economy, living conditions, and food availability. Like many other wars, it took a lot of work from surviving civilians to rebuild Spain after the devastation that the war had caused. Food insecurity was something that everyone in Spain was affected by during this time. A large portion of our society was deeply impacted by the war, both physically and drastically due to its effects. It affected ordinary people's lives for decades, even after the war.
Hunger and suffering were essential conditions that all soldiers faced during the wartime experience, but mainly soldiers made traps for hunting, stole crops from civilians, ate herbs to stay afloat. This lack of proper nutrition caused immense distress for families and soldiers. To have some control over the food insecurity, the Spanish government on both sides presented civilians with ration coupons. The coupons were thin sheets of paper with perforations cut into small squares so that coupons could individually be torn off. The coupons had propaganda pictures on the front and coupons for rations on the back, a literal double-sided meaning to them. On the one side, promoting the cause and inspiring nationalism, and the other side, giving rations to share the small amounts of food with supporters.
Some of the rations seen on the backside were rice, beans, bread, etc., mainly anything that families could use to avoid starvation. These coupons were not seen as a luxury because they were allowed for only the bare necessities to be attained, nothing lavish. Each side of the war had their own coupons printed with their own propaganda. Even if civilians wanted to stay away from the conflict and separation of the country, they had to see this propaganda constantly because of how badly rations were needed, due to not only the food scarcity, but also the state of the economy.
The coupons depicted brightly colored images with a variety of different sayings and slogans that were used to get different points across to civilians. A large majority of the coupons had the words Auxilio Social written on the top, usually written in a bold font. When translated to English, this means social assistance, which further proves the meaning of these coupons, to help society. Each of these coupons had different illustrations on them to paint different stories to be viewed by each civilian. Mujeres ingresad en la Juventud Socialista Unificada is seen in one example of these ration coupons, accompanied by an image of 3 women walking and looking to be armed for battle. When translated, we can read it as "You die, join the Unified Socialist Youth." These harsh words, along with the bright colors, show the significance and impact that these coupons may have had on civilians during the war.
Another coupon reads Obreros de la Construcción Ingresad en el Batallón de Fortificación, meaning construction workers join the fortification battalion. We can tell what message they are trying to send with this propaganda because this phrase is accompanied by images of laborers working on what looks like to be a construction site. This is significant because we know every day people and workers were encouraged to join the fight and give aid to their country. Many of the coupons follow this pattern of sending a message to society but use varying different situational propaganda to get their points across.
For this coupon, we can see a father and son in what looks to be a very emotional scene. The paper reads, Alivia la ausencia del padre con los donivos. When translated, it means relieves father's absence with donations. From a naked eye, people might not understand the context of this line, but when knowing about what is going on during this time period, it becomes crystal clear. Because so many civilians were drawn to the war, many families felt the tragic absence of loved ones. The creator of these coupons wants to convince people to donate to the war by using emotional ties to pull at the heartstrings of those in possession of these coupons.
Some of the other coupons depicted Indians, horses, soldiers, families, and children. While the topic of propaganda used as the imagery may differ from coupon to coupon, the message remains the same: to gain support concerning the Spanish Civil War from both sides of the battlefield, and to spark animosity into the minds of civilians and pursue aid into the war itself. These coupons helped many families stay afloat during the difficult financial times and food scarcity. Without the help of these simple pieces of paper, many families would not have survived.
Even when the war was over, the impacts of it will still linger for much longer. Many people were left suffering and the economy was destroyed. Spain still feels the impact of the war that took place from 1936 to 1939. Rations were heavily depended on during a strong policy of repression after the war.
The coupons were such a detrimental part of the war, not only because they were so heavily relied on for food and other resources, but because of what they represented in the war. These coupons represented the two sides of the war: propaganda, the communism scare, and the state of Spain during the war.
Overall, the Spanish Civil War was a time of hardship, but also is a period of time that we can study to truly get a feel for what society was like. These coupons bring to life what families had to go through and the things that they lost in the process. Without the Spanish Civil War, we would not have been able to appreciate how far society has come and how much we as people have changed as well.